Petra is head of the ZRC SAZU Milko-Kos Historical Institute and a lecturer at the University of Nova Gorica and the postgraduate school of ZRC SAZU. Her research is primarily centered, obviously, on the First World War, with a particular emphasis on topics such as occupation, violence against civilians, war memories, victims, gender dynamics, and urban history in this pivotal period. Petra is an established author of books and articles, notably the publication Years of Horror, Slovenes and the First World War, won a prestigious Clio Prize awarded by the Historical Association of Slovenia in 2019 and 2020. Her paper, The War to End All Wars, A Broken Promise of Peace. Thank you, Petra.
Thank you, Martin, for the invitation and for this kind presentation. So I will start. The War That Will End War is the title of H.G. Wells's 1914 book, in which he optimistically declared that, I quote, "This, the greatest of all wars, it is not just another war, it's the last war. This is already the vastest war in history. It is not a war of nations, but a war of mankind. It is a war to exercise a word, madness, and end an age. For this is now a war for peace. It aims straight at disarmament. It aims at a settlement that shall stop this kind of thing forever," end quote. But let's start with some historical overview of the relationship between wars and peace movements. The first peace societies emerged between 1814 and 1816 in the United States and England, followed by France and Switzerland in 1821 and 1830, and it was only after 1850s that other European countries joined the peace movements. For the contemporary continental European peace movements, the wars waged for national unity were perfectly legitimate. But in the last 2 decades of the century, new organizations emerged whose demands for conciliation and disarmament reflected the general crisis of the international system in the age of imperialism. In 1889, pacifists began holding annual meetings called the World Peace Congresses, and in the same year, lawmakers from the several European nations established annual interparliamentary conferences, soon renamed in Interparliamentary Union, to discuss important foreign policy issues and recommend measures to reduce tensions and promote reconciliation. In 1889, the Austrian writer Berta von Suttner published her book Die Waffen nieder, Lay Down Your Arms, bringing the peace movement to the Habsburg Empire. The Austrian Peace Society was thus founded in 1891 and initially had around 2,000 members. In 1905, Berta von Suttner, who was also described as the generalissimo of the peace movement, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. She was the first woman to receive the Peace Prize, and I quote, "for her audacity to oppose the horrors of war," end quote. The Nobel Prize Committee considered her anti-war novel to be one of the most influential books in the 19th century. And she was also a close friend of Alfred Nobel and is said to have convinced him to endow a Peace Prize. In 1982, so I will just close this paragraph. Berta von Suttner then died, let's say, a week before the assassination of Sarajevo, so on the 21st of June 1914, and let's say fortunately she didn't witness the horrors of the Great War. But nevertheless, in 1892, Berta von Suttner and Alfred Hermann Fried founded the first pacifist association in Germany, the German Peace Society, with the aim of attracting greater attention from politicians and other public media, such as newspapers. Over the time, however, the peace movement changed its goals towards a ban on war and declared, as Fritz said, that it was not fighting against war, but against its causes, and therefore they didn't want peace that would result from a war situation. Peace activists optimistically pointed to tangible signs of an emerging international system, and so the International Peace Bureau was founded in Bern in 1882. In 1899, the Hague Peace Conference was organized, followed by another in 1907, and the prospect of a third in 1915. Peace activists interpreted the Hague Peace Conferences as proof that the great powers were responding positively, albeit hesitantly, to the emerging international spirit of reconciliation. The Hague Convention of 1899 prepared a written code on the laws of war on land and drafted a convention that contained highly controversial articles on military occupation and people's resistance to it. The Second Hague Conference in 1907 had the task of codifying the law of warfare at sea in order to protect international trade from the so-called surprises of war as well. However, in their combination of law and ethics, the Hague Conventions laid down lasting principles for the conduct of war, defined a code of conduct for war, and reaffirmed the relevance of customary international law, even in the absence of a formal positive code. The conferences paved the way for an informal international court of arbitration to resolve future conflicts. Questions of war and peace also preoccupied the socialists in the years leading up to the First World War. The resolution on war and peace adopted at the Paris Peace Congress of the Second International in 1900 condemned standing arms and called for national defense by the armed people, declaring that the advent of socialism would abolish war by itself. May Day, the popular symbol of international solidarity, had already been regarded as a day for peace and better working conditions since the Congress in Zurich in 1893. But the first real discussions about resistance to war took place at Amsterdam Congress in 1904, when the Russo-Japanese War was at its height. At that time, the general strike was seen as a means of opposing the war. But the greatest socialist manifestation against the war was the Basel Congress in 1912, in the middle of the First Balkan War, which declared war and urged the social democratic parties to continue their action by all means, which appear likely to be effectual. As Gerhard Senft noted, the peace movements before 1914 achieved an astonishing degree of diversity, from bourgeois pacifism to social anti-militarism. At the beginning of 1914, the seemingly robust European peace movement numbered 190 peace societies, some with thousands of members, publishing 23 journals and in 10 languages. The newly founded Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in the United States even provided the International Peace Bureau with a modest annual grant, which was redistributed to the European peace societies. But in the summer of 1914, the belligerent spirit and ever stronger hate-mongering prevailed. In the European public sphere, the majority opinion remained, I quote, inclined towards defensive patriotism, end quote, so that peace was preferred, but war remained acceptable under circumstances. In 1914, politicians exploited patriotic pacifism to secure popular or even mass support for the war. Even strong pacifist voices were affected by this. And Stern gives the example of Stefan Zweig, who admitted that, I quote, "There is something grand, electrifying and seductive in this first sailing forth of the masses," or that of Thomas Mann, who felt that the war to be cleansing, and Albert Einstein, who noted that, I quote, "All the learned men at the universities have accepted military service or jobs." On the other hand, there were voices that were not silenced, and Romain Rolland, thank you, Martin, for reminding me, was one of them. For his literature, the novel Jean-Christophe in 10 volumes and the pamphlet, I will try it in French, Au-dessus de la mêlée, The Soul Enchanted, or Above the Battle, the translations are different, but anyway, these two translations appear in the literature. An appeal to France and Germany to respect truth and humanity during their struggle in the First World War. He was awarded the 1916 in 1916 the Nobel Prize for 1915 because, according to philosopher and political scientist Lowes Dickinson, I quote, Mr. Roland is among the many who believe, though their voice for the moment may be silenced, that the spiritual forces that are important and ought to prevail are the international ones. That cooperation, not war, is the right destiny of nations, and that all that is valuable in each people may be maintained and by friendly intercourse with the others. Hundreds of thousands of generous youth have gone to the battle in the belief that they are going to a war that will end war, that they are fighting against militarism in the cause of peace. Whether indeed it is for that they will have risked or lost their lives, only the event can show, end quote. In the introduction, Roland states, a great nation assailed by war has not only its frontiers to protect, it must also protect its good sense. It must protect itself from the hallucinations, injustices, and follies which the plague lets loose. To each his part, to the armies, the protection of the soil, of their native land, to the thinkers, the defense of its thought. If they subordinate that thought to the passions of their people, they may well be useful instruments of passion. But they are in danger of betraying the spirit, which is not the least part of a people's patrimony. One day, history will pass judgment on each of the nations at war. She will weigh their measures of errors, lies, and heinous follies. Let us try and make ours light before her, end quote. Just a footnote. Nothing had been heard of Romain Rolland, of him in France for a year. His article Above the Battle of September 1914 was not published almost in its entirety until June 1915, for his guiding principle was to be just and humane, and although he had made many enemies, he didn't allow them to teach him to hate. He did not regard the war as a fatality, which was for him a soul without a will. For Roland, war springs from the weakness and stupidity of nations. According to Elisa Marcobelli, the majority of socialists did not deny their patriotism, and the idea of defending the fatherland was shared by many of their members. Thus, the international socialist movement broke up after July crisis in 1914, even after many anti-war demonstrations in the spring of that year. Numerous socialist members of various governments voted for the war credits. Many members of the German peace movement and socialists defended the Germany declaration of war on the grounds that Germany was waging a defensive war. But according to Senft, the enthusiasm for a war in 1914 is only a myth, which can also be confirmed by diaries and letters from soldiers. The general conviction was that the war would be short and victorious, but even at the beginning of the war, soldiers on the fronts were looking for ways and means to avoid war, from desertion to avoiding conscription and military uprisings in the third year of the war. In 1918, a series of military mutinies also took place in the Austrian-Hungarian army. The first was the so-called socialist uprising at the naval base of Kotor, where Bolshevik slogans were also proclaimed, and the Soviet of Sailors was organized to lead the uprisings. On the other hand, the May uprisings were a combination of national unrest war weariness, poor treatment, and the expectation of another withdrawal to the front. The majority in the insurgent units were of Slavic origin, and the leaders were the returnees from the Russian captivity, where they had witnessed the Bolshevik Revolution that led to the armistice which ended the war for the Russians. And that was the most important message for the prisoners of war. A revolution had the power to end the war. With this message, they returned home, joined their original units after a process of political quarantine, and were to be sent back to the front. The only option seemed to have been the uprisings, whose main aim was to end the war and go home, no less and no more. The uprisings were ended violently by executing the leaders by example. So the US remained a bastion of pacifism for a long time, with a very strong peace movement that spanned a vast social spectrum and was able to delay the decision of the United States to end the war. In fact, Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1916 on the basis of his anti-war program. An important role in the peace movement during the war was played by the women's peace movement, which met in Hague in 1915, at the end of April to May the 1st, for the International Congress of Women. The Congress developed a roadmap for enduring peace. They passed 20 resolutions, 5 of which were principles for a permanent peace, which, according to John Paul, were a gendered response to a gendered war. They declared, I quote, "We women protest against the madness and the horror of war, involving as it does a reckless sacrifice of human life and the destruction of so much that humanity has labored through centuries to build up," end quote. They urged for the third Hague Peace Conference and recommended the creation of the Society of Nations that would safeguard the international peace, general disarmament, and demanded that all secret treaties be void. Hence, the so-called London Memorandum or Treaty was signed by the Entente Powers on April 26, which urged Italy to enter the war against its former ally, Austria-Hungary, and marked Italy's future eastern border. The content of this treaty was secret and never went through parliamentary procedures in any of the Allied powers, and was only made public by the Bolshevik Revolution in 1970. But also, the Women Congress also proposed to establish a permanent court to settle questions or disagreements of a legitimate nature. The congressional resolution was also forwarded to the American President Wilson, who in 1918, in the 14th point of his 14 points, foresaw the creation of a League of Nations as a future peace conference, at a future peace conference. A coincidence? Also worth mentioning are the Slovenian women, who were the driving force behind the so-called May Declaration movement, a movement in support of the declaration of the Yugoslav deputies in the Vienna Parliament, which met at the end of May 1917 for the first time after March 14. The declaration pointed to the need for reorganization of the monarchy, whereupon a broad movement spread across the territories of the so-called Slovenian crownlands, supported by women who collected more than 300,000 signatures of women and spoke out in favor of the declaration. But they also demanded peace and the return of their husbands and sons from the front. The war officially ended on November 11, 1918, and this is the Western point of view, when Germany signed the armistice and hostilities between the Allies and the Central Powers. Germany ceased. But as Robert Lansing, the US Secretary of State, noted in his diary on January 22, 1919, I quote, "The Great War seems to have split into a lot of wars." For there were fightings in the Balkans, Poland was at war with its neighbors, and civil war was still raging in Russia. Modern Western historiography of the First World War has therefore upgraded the term the Great War to the Greater War, also taking into account the temporal and finally also geographical and colonial dimensions of the war. Preparations for the peace conference began under these unpeaceful circumstances. The conference opened without a clear agenda, with the German peace terms, the wider aspects of the European and global settlement, and issues such as the League of Nations up for debate. The conference itself had no great precedents from the past, the only one being the Congress of Vienna, which rounded off the long Napoleonic Wars, but it should be noted that the tone of the negotiations at the Congress of Vienna was amicable, regardless of the differences between winners and losers, exactly the opposite of the atmosphere and starting point in the Paris in 1919. The armistice, the interval between the lowering and rising of the curtain, as Clemenceau vividly put it, and later the peace agreements were based on the origins and the nature of war itself. Clemenceau in this regard was unequivocal. The Germans were to blame for the catastrophe of 1914, and only a professional liar would doubt that. 27 victorious and 10 states and 5 British dominions took part at in the conference, while the losers were only allowed to accept the peace terms. A clear line was drawn between the victors and the losers, although the position of the victors was not equal either, as their role in the war was not the same, nor were the losses or war damage. The most obvious and conspicuous absence was certainly that of Russia. In the first half of 1918, Russia's presence at the probable peace conference was still possible, and studies were made of the territories along Russia's western border. Later, however, the Bolshevik regime came under virtual blockade of the West, trade and diplomatic routes were cut off, and even the newspapers had recalled their reporters by early 1919. Of course, the absence of Russia, which had helped the Western allies in many ways during the 3 years of war, also raised legal questions, as it was still technically an ally and was also at war with Germany, which had been forced to abrogate the Brest-Litovsk armistice when it accepted the terms of the armistice with the Western allies. But Clemenceau insisted that Russia was a traitor because it had signed an armistice with Germany, which gave the latter access to territory and raw materials and freed the German army to continue the war on the West, opening a window for the Bolshevik regime to impose the Marxist millennium. In Clemenceau's view, this freed the Western allies from any promises to Russia, including access to the straits between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. But Russia, as the specialist saw it, was omnipresent in his absence, shaping the peace in many ways. According to Wilson's supporter Ray Stannard Baker, and the borders of the new Baltic states met the expectations, and their neighbors could not be finalized until relations with Russia were defined. Nothing was left to chance at the opening ceremony, and the losers were spared nothing. The German delegation was the last to be admitted into the hall and had to pass a group of French veterans with disfigured faces on their way to the balcony. Their bandages covering the terrible wounds, symbolizing the victims awaiting redemption. These soldiers were not called to deliver a message of peace. They were victims of the horrors of modern technological warfare, and the passing German delegation had to reaffirm the moral condemnation of their crimes and, of course, war guilt, as enshrined in the Article 231 of the future Versailles Peace Treaty. It was therefore also completely illusory that the peace treaties signed at the Paris Peace Conference would bring lasting peace, because, as already mentioned, they were based on the nature of war itself, on its totality, its capillarity, on the complete mobilization of the mind by means of unprecedented propaganda, not least the demonization of the opponents with whom a peace treaty had to be concluded in 1919. It was true that it was questionable whether a just peace could actually be achieved if Article 231 of the future Treaty of Versailles exclusively blamed Germany for the outbreak of war, which was mainly a German post-war interpretation, as the article, let's say, divided the blame between Germany and its allies, which had either disintegrated or been substantially territorially disenfranchised. While on the other hand, the Western allies were also convinced of Germany's fundamental culpability for the outbreak of the war, which led to a reparation plan being established to ensure that Germany would never again pose a military threat. The Treaty of Versailles was revised and amended in the following years, mostly in Germany's favor. Nevertheless, according to many historians, the combination of a tough treaty and the subsequent lax enforcement of its provisions paved the way for the rise of German militarism in the 1930s. The decisions of the Paris Peace Conference had long-term consequences, not only in Europe. They led to new practices of settling the population problems through the exchange of populations. They shaped the modern Middle East. They created a modern and mass refugee problem and the clash of unresolved territorial interests into modern times. Not even the founding of the League of Nations, as already mentioned, could guarantee lasting peace. And ironically, the US Senate did not approve of American participation in this organization. Certainly, the view still prevails today that a golden opportunity was missed, and that, as distinguished British soldier Archibald Wavell, who served in both World Wars, said, "The war to end all wars successfully made the peace that ended peace." Paris became the world capital of first aid, as Margaret Macmillan called it, with a grand plan to create a new European and world order, but without the right tools to implement it. So thank you for your attention.